Foundation. This is a Jimmy Reid Foundation event. And for those of you who don't know what the Reid Foundation is, I'll just give you a very kind of quick summary. We're an independent left think tank founded in Jimmy's name. And our aim is to continue the legacy of radical political thinking in Scotland and beyond. And that's hopefully what will be part of the theme of the discussion tonight. But just to also say, as a way of introduction as well, that the Reid Foundation is 10 years old this month on the 10th of August. And over the past 10 years, we've produced nearly 100 publications, and we've done dozens of meetings and quite a few in this format here. And every year we do an annual lecture, and we can give you some more information about this year's lecture later on. But tonight's meeting is to discuss the critique of the Scottish Government's Fair Work policy, which was published back in June. If you look at the chat, information and links to that publication and other bits of information throughout the meeting will be posted there for your information. But it's because Fair Work is a flagship SNP policy. It's something that all of us in the labour and trade union movement and in the wider left need to continuously debate and discuss seriously. The Scottish Government has said that Scotland should be a fair work nation, or will be a fair work nation by 2025, and yet there's no compulsion on employers. So one of the big questions is how can that possibly be achieved? So I never introduced myself at the beginning. My name is Lynn Henderson, and I am the chair of the Reid Foundation Project Board. And with me tonight is the director of the Jimmy Reid Foundation, Professor Gregor Gall, who's the author of the paper, who's going to take us through the critique. And then our discussant tonight is Ros Foye, who's the General Secretary of the STUC. So I'm hoping that they will stimulate a fair bit of discussion. And then I know that we'll have time at the end for questions and contributions. Now, because of the format of the meeting, because so many people have registered, what I'll ask people to do is, if you have comments or questions, if you place them in the chat, I'll seek to at least, if not read them out, certainly introduce the themes so that Gregor and Ros can respond to those. So without any further ado then, let me introduce Gregor to speak.
Thank you. Good evening to you all. Thanks for attending, and thanks in particular to Ros for being the discussant. Before I summarise the paper, I want to give some historical context in terms of political economy that I think is relevant to providing a broader context to what the subject matter is. And here I think there are four long-standing concerns and debates which are needed to look at in order to situate the topic of and the critique of the Scottish Government's Fair Work policy. The first one is that fair work is part of a wider discourse which includes good work, decent work, better work, also good work, good jobs, decent jobs, better jobs. And you can find examples of policy initiatives and some actual practice about those things in Wales, where a social partnership bill is going through the Welsh Parliament and will be an act later this year. You'll also find examples in city regions like Merseyside and Greater Manchester, and much further afield and also earlier than happening in Britain, there are examples, particularly of fair work, to be found in Australia and New Zealand. They're not all the same, they're quite different. For example, in Australia and New Zealand, there is a statutory underpinning to some of the fair work policies. So what I'm really saying here is that there's a wider context to it in a geographical sense. I think what unites all of these attempts that I've just mentioned, whether it's Wales or further afield, is essentially that Fair Work is about a revulsion against the effects of neoliberalism and attempts to create an alternative to it, albeit within the framework of existing neoliberalism. Now, what that means, I think, is that we're not talking about social democracy, where the state seeks to intervene in the processes and outcomes of the market. So not like something that we might have thought of, after the Second World War in Britain in 1945, but rather attempts through voluntary regulation or soft regulation, which is a phrase that's used, to try to influence the behaviour of employers in particular, particularly private sector employers. And that can often be best described as social liberalism, particularly because, as I say, it's voluntary, and therefore what that means is there are no coercive or punitive measures underpinning them. And part of the voluntary aspect there is that essentially a business case is made to employers that if they take the high road of so-called valuing their employees and treating them fairly and treating them with respect, that will be their route to competitive advantage. But of course, at the same time, we must recognise that there are other means, other routes to competitive advantage, the main other one being the low road, which is to cut wages, cut conditions, and to increase the level of exploitation. So that wider debate about fair work has to be borne in mind. I think the second theme, if you like, is about social partnership, not of the continental European kind, where often there is a legal underpinning to it, but of the Anglo-American kind, which is quite often at the micro rather than the macro level. And here for unions, we have the dangers of incorporation into an employer-led agenda. We have the challenge of trying to make mutual gains work, if that is at all possible. And all that is to be done in a period of union weakness. Essentially, unions could be said to being offered crumbs off the table of capital and the employers. So that's the second context. The third is to do with state intervention. Certainly in terms of Britain, there has been a history going back over a century of the belief that free collective bargaining, where there's no state involvement or very little state involvement, is what unions should seek to have. They should be sufficiently powerful that they don't rely on or need to have the state involved, and they shouldn't have the state restrict any of their activities. So that's seen as being historically the highest form of union power. Of course, the situation today is that collective bargaining has been characterised by some as, in effect, collective begging, where unions are so enfeebled that they cannot carry out free, independent collective bargaining. And so the issue, when you contrast the historical situation with the contemporary situation, is how do we square the circle of getting unions back to being much more important and influential players, but without necessarily relying on the state. One, when that state intervention or support can be withdrawn, but also recognising that states tend to have their own agendas and interests, which may not be always the same as those of unions. And then the fourth one, which I think should come as no surprise, is the one about independence and what I would say, not the British road to socialism, but more the British road to social democracy. With the high tide of Corbynism having ebbed out in late 2019 and then the change in the leadership of the Labour Party, is it now the case that independence provides the only credible route to a situation where the state, a Scottish state, could regulate capital? What kind of independence would that have to be in order for that to happen? And is the current SNP Scottish Government capable of doing that? And if it's not a question of counterposing social democracy to independence, where does Devo Max stand in all this? At the moment, many of the unions, and including, I think, the STUC, have policy favouring the devolution of employment law to Scotland. Would that be sufficient to lead to a situation where labour workers are more powerful, or would there have to be further measures to enforce that and support it? So those are some of the long-standing historical debates and concerns that inform what this paper is about. And they take me to the point of asking a much more kind of immediate set of questions around the Scottish Government's Fair Work policy. In essence, the two or maybe three questions are, is the Scottish Government doing all that they can with the limited powers that they have? And if that is the case, does it then mean that any criticism of the Scottish Government is misplaced because you're saying, in effect, that they should be doing something, but they are not entitled by law, by the devolution settlement to do that? Or can we pose a question of a different order, which is to say, can they be doing more with the actual powers that they do have, especially over procurement, and especially in a situation of post-Brexit where European Union rules on competition and regulation no longer apply? And in the background, maybe there's also a further question, which is that would an SNP government, even if it had those additional powers, would it actually use them? And I think that has to, for the moment, remain an open question. So let me move on to actually summarise the paper. Lynn's stolen a little bit of my thunder by telling you that the Fair Work policy has been in operation since 2016. The aim of it is to create Scotland as a fair work nation by 2025, so only about 4.5 years away. And the definition of what a fair work nation would look like is informed by the policy document called the Fair Work Framework, which the Fair Work Convention published a few years ago. And essentially it concerns 5 dimensions, if you like, 5 aims or ambitions. One is voice, which does include unions, but isn't necessarily predicated on unions. Second one is opportunity of employment, of choice and in employment. The third is to do with security of employment, but also might include terms and conditions of employment. The fourth one is respect, primarily respect of the employer to its workforce. And the fifth one is fulfillment, as in personal fulfillment or the fulfillment of group objectives. Now, whatever I'm about to say, I do want to make it clear that this is an advance on the previous memorandums of understanding that existed between the STUC and Scottish governments from 1999 until 2011. In effect, the Fair Work policy is much more ambitious than those. And so that, as I say, has to be recognised. Having said all that, and this is really the crux of the matter, the rhetoric and words of the Scottish Government's Fair Work policy are not matched by its deeds or its actions. And that, in my view, fundamentally comes down to the fact that there is almost nothing in the way of statutory regulation or statutory underpinning to the Fair Work policy. To put it another way, the Fair Work policy is something which the Scottish Government encourages and cajoles employers into doing, but has no and is not willing to apply any coercive or punitive powers in order to do that. And this is the case even with what's called the Fair Work First policy, which was the major development on from the launching of the Fair Work Framework. In the Fair Work First policy, all and any forms of government funding have the following caveat to them. And that is that those that are in receipt of this government funding are asked, are expected, and are encouraged to implement those 5 dimensions or aspirations that I've talked about. However, those words, ask, expect, encourage, are all to do with guidance. They are not instructions and they are not obligations. They're not even moral obligations. They're not even moral instructions. They are just guidance. And so when we come to look at the evidence for what impact the Fair Work policy has had since 2016, I think any reasonable estimation would say that it's been slight and it's also been very disappointing. But before that, I want to just make a couple of other comments before I move on to, as I say, the kind of research that underpins these findings. The first is that there's something of a paradox in the broad definitions of those 5 dimensions of the Fair Work policy. You could say, on the one hand, it doesn't really matter that they're broad and they're somewhat vague, because there is no legal underpinning to them. So in essence, it doesn't matter. But on the other hand, you could say that because there is no legal underpinning to them, and because they are vague and broad, many employers can say, with some good reason, with some good cause, that they already implement fair work. And I think that is unfortunately not a strength, but a weakness. Now, when you look at the Scottish Government documentation on this, dating all the way back to 2016, the government is, technically we're talking about more than one government, we're talking about several governments, but if I can use the collective noun as just the single Scottish government, they are very proud of what they've achieved. And it's almost a bit like the emperor's new clothes. They see something that's not really there. And that's what I want to demonstrate when I look at these issues. Now, the research that I conducted for this paper is based on secondary sources. So the strength of this research is that it is broad in its sweep, but it also has a weakness that it lacks depth. Essentially because I'm either looking at statistics provided by the Scottish Government, and I'm not at this point casting any doubt on the veracity of those statistics, but when you look at the data that I generated from unions, it's the data that they have put into the public domain, particularly through their press releases and other social media information, and it's primarily about disputes that they want to make known to the public for their purposes of prosecuting their campaigns. So what that means in effect is that many things that go on behind the scenes and underneath the surface are not recorded, and that's why in the paper I recognise that there is a need for primary research to be conducted. In terms of looking at the union evidence, what I did was I started from the 1st of January 2018 and I finished on the 31st of March this year. And the reason I started a bit later than the 2016 point was to allow the Fair Work policy to embed, if you like, to give it the benefit of the doubt. And in particular, to look at the period when the Fair Work First policy was in operation. So if we look at some of the statistics that come from the Scottish Government on the living wage, which is one of the key aspects of fair work, and it's also to be found within the Scottish Business Pledge, which includes other things such as not using so-called exploitative zero-hour contracts. That is to say that the terminology allows for some use of zero-hour contracts. Well, when you look at the data, and the latest figures because of the impact of COVID are up to January 2020, so coming up for 18 months ago, what you find is that 5.1% of the working population in Scotland is now covered by the living wage. So it's not high, but of course we must recognise that not all workers in Scotland would benefit from the living wage because they're paid more than that. But then when you look at the kind of some of the detail, you come to understand that it's not just the Scottish Business Pledge or the actions of the Scottish Government that account for the 5.1%, limited as though that is. And what you also probably come to realise is that the living wage in itself is not sufficient. I don't mean just in terms of what it's set at, but you may be aware of there's also a thing called the Living Hours campaign, which is testament to the fact that even if you earn the living wage per hour, you may not be able to work sufficient hours to deliver a living wage overall. Then you look at the Fair Work Convention report of late 2020, which is probably the most extensive piece of work done by the convention or the Scottish Government, because it looks at many measures. And while some of it is useful and I think relevant and statistically significant or robust, quite a lot of it isn't. In particular, the report allows the Fair Work framework to take credit for developments which at best are only weakly related to the Fair Work framework, or at worst have nothing to do with it. And that's because the data that they use to come to these conclusions doesn't demonstrate any order of causation. It doesn't demonstrate the link between cause and effect or the direction of causation. So in effect, what they're doing is they're taking data that is there primarily because there is no other data and trying to make something out of it, but in doing so, coming to quite misplaced conclusions. When I turn to look at the evidence of the experience of unions, and this is detailed in considerable length in the paper, which I won't go into, but there are a significant catalogue of disputes, sometimes involving industrial action, sometimes involving strikes, within either the public sector or organisations which receive all or significant amounts of funding from the Scottish Government. So here are two cases, the public sector and then the funding of organisations, where you would expect the Scottish Government would have more ability to intervene and to ensure that the Fair Work agenda was implemented. And what I'm suggesting is that that intervention or that regulation of those employers is not happening, because if it was, then you wouldn't have so many disputes, and you wouldn't have so many cases of people feeling compelled to take forms of industrial action which involve the loss of wages, even if there is some strike pay involved in, accounting for that sacrifice. And this situation that I identified up until the 31st of March this year has continued. I'll just give you two examples. You'll possibly be aware of the continuing disputes on ScotRail, which is publicly funded and next year will be taken into public ownership. You may also be aware of the one-day strike that took place recently in the Highlands and Islands Airports Limited with the Prospect Union. So those are examples of where you would think and expect the Scottish Government would lean on those employers and say, you must settle this dispute, on terms which at least are satisfactory to the workers concerned. Then you turn to the private sector, and here the signs of the positive effect of the Fair Work policy are even weaker. Where, for example, union recognition has been won recently in the private sector, it's got almost nothing to do with the Fair Work policy. Yes, the Fair Work policy might be used in a rhetorical way to say that employers should be doing what the Scottish Government encourages them to do, but ultimately it's the threat of campaigning, brand damage, reputation damage, and sometimes threats of industrial action that have led to employers recognising them. And I think that's very much the case in hospitality with Unite's campaign there to gain fair employment terms and sometimes also union recognition. And then you turn to another example in the private sector of closures of strategically important capacity in infrastructure building or manufacturing. The Caledonian Railworks are one of the most obvious examples. BIFAB would be another, even though there was some limited Scottish Government intervention there. So those pieces of evidence suggest that the Fair Work policy has had a very limited positive effect. I would say I didn't detect any negative impact, if you like, other than some employers saying that they already do some of these things, even if that doesn't involve recognising a union. But that was relatively limited. And then when you come to some of the kind of, if you like, grander issues or macro issues, union density in Scotland, although it's slightly stabilised in the last few years, has still not returned to the point at which it was before the Fair Work policy was implemented. The same is true, of the coverage of collective bargaining, which is absolutely essential in ensuring that levels of inequality don't remain or in fact are not made worse. And then ironically, when you look at the indications of strike activity in Scotland, although much reduced compared to 10, 20 and 30 years ago, Scotland is regularly one of the most strike-prone, if you like, regions compared to other parts of Britain overall. And so again, that's not something you would expect if the Fair Work policy was making a difference. And then I just want to turn to the issue of what happened after the elections in May this year. It was quite clear from the SNP's manifesto that it was going to continue with its Fair Work policy in the guise that it already existed. So what I'm saying here is that the SNP in its manifesto did not make any intention clear to strengthen the Fair Work policy, certainly not of the, of the nature of the kind of thing that I've been suggesting that it should do. And that was why that when this report was released after the election, in the Herald, for example, one of the key phrases that it used to characterise the research in this paper was that the SNP's Fair Work policy is being oversold. That is to say that they are claiming too much for it on the basis of having too little evidence to support those claims. And one of the major tests of Fair Work will be when the National Care Service is set up, which may still take a while. But one of the key things that the STUC and other unions will be looking for is whether there is going to be sectoral bargaining included as part of the way that there is the fair determination of pay and conditions of those that work in that care service. And essentially, I wouldn't hold my breath on that, although obviously I remain hopeful. Now, you'll be aware that the Greens are shortly to conclude some kind of coalition agreement with the SNP in order that they create a majority government in Holyrood. And if you therefore turn to the Greens manifesto, you find that if the Greens are to stick to what was in their manifesto, and they are to argue for it and use whatever leverage they do have with their 8 seats in the coalition with the SNP, then there would be some key advances, because one of the policies of the Green Party, the Scottish Green Party, is to make union recognition compulsory where public funds are dispensed to private sector employers. Now, I'm not wanting to raise expectations too much, because I wonder whether that will remain a priority amongst all the other things that the Green Party wishes to pursue, and also whether having 8 seats will allow the leverage that you would need to, if you like, enforce that upon the SNP Scottish Government. So let me come to a conclusion now. The Fair Work policy so far, and as I would project in the future, certainly up to 2025, has had and will have a limited impact, a limited positive impact. It's limited in process, because processes are important not only because they determine outcomes, but also because there are issues to do with procedural justice that are different, if you like, or separate from justice, the bare bones of an outcome. So it's been deficient in process, as in how workers' terms and conditions are decided, but it's also been deficient in terms of what those outcomes are, what pay rates are like, what security workers have, whether they have access to an independent union to represent their interests. However, I'm not saying that the Fair Work policy is worthless, and I'm not saying that it's negligible in its impact either. Clearly, some 130,000 workers in Scotland, even if I've raised questions about who is the who actually led to that situation, and that's when I said that it wasn't just the SNP government. But, and again, going back to what Lynn said at the outset, it is incomprehensible that the Fair Work policy as it stands will get anywhere near to the scale of what is needed to be achieved, either in terms of the Fair Work Nation by 2025, or by any other independent assessment by an academic or by somebody who's external to the SNP and the Scottish Government. And therefore, this leads me to 2 suggestions, which I think Ros may well develop and add to. But one of the things that the union movement needs to not only raise, because it has raised already, but work out ways of enforcing or pressing harder, is to achieve a situation where the Scottish Government will provide for the regulations and the structures and facilitate sectoral agreements. That is to say that, one, that they should exist, so that we take wages out of competition, wages out of as a factor out of competition between different competing employers, and that tends to, all other things being equal, raise up wages. So we need those agreements to exist, but we also need employers to be bound by them, so that if an employer who is part of one sector is applying for and getting Scottish Government money of whatever type, then they are bound by a regulation to apply those terms from the sectoral agreement to the wages and conditions of those that they employ when they are in receipt of government money. And the second thing is that the Scottish Government must take much more seriously the role that unions play. It's all very well saying that there are different forms of employee representation. And yes, in this, the text that Scottish Government has issued, there is some special emphasis upon unions, but I still think it doesn't go far enough in acknowledging that unions are the only independent bodies to represent workers, independent in resources, but also independent in terms of ideology. And that means that they are quite different in their stock and trade from anything that you might get from an employer through a staff council or a works council. So those are the two suggestions that I would make that we could try to take forward. Thank you for listening.
Okay, thank you very much, Gregor. There's a lot of food for thought in there for all of us. And I think it's really important that we do have Ros from the STUC here to discuss and respond to some of that. There's many people will know the STUC has been deeply engaged in the development of fair work in Scotland, and amongst others, I myself was involved deeply in negotiating a fair work policy for Scottish Government workers themselves. So there's some questions there, I think, that the Ros might answer, but I think it's important that in this debate, we're remembering that we are debating this in the movement, and we haven't asked anyone from the Scottish Government to come along and defend their position, because it's actually not about their position. This is about our debate on our side of the table. So on that note, Ros, I'll invite you to make your contribution, and then we'll see if we can draw some themes and questions out of that. So welcome to the floor, Ros.
Thanks very much, Lynn, and thank you to the Jimmy Reid Foundation for inviting me along to discuss this paper with Gregor. And I'd also like to thank the Jimmy Reid Foundation and Gregor Gall in particular for the work that has been carried out on this research paper. I actually see this as a very welcome intervention at a key time, and some might say that this is a make or break time for the fair work agenda in Scotland. And I think having a critical assessment of fair work in Scotland, whether it is effective and whether it's delivering to its full potential, is exactly where we need to have our attention right now. And I should also start by declaring an interest, because I've recently, as the incoming General Secretary of the STUC, accepted an invitation to join the Fair Work Convention, the board of it, and I'm already playing an active role within the Fair Work Convention as a member of the inquiry group into the construction sector. And there are a range of senior trade unionists on both the convention board, but also involved in those, who were involved in the care inquiry, who are currently involved in the construction sector inquiry, and who no doubt will be involved going forward in the hospitality sector inquiry. So we have trade unionists currently there representing their unions from Unite, from Unison and from Prospect, as well as myself from the STUC. Our current Scottish Government, as has been said, has long promoted the fair work agenda as one of their key policies. And I think we have to start by acknowledging that, they actually do get a lot of kudos from having this policy framework. They get a lot of kudos out of having a Fair Work Minister, out of mentioning Fair Work law, out of having set up a Fair Work Convention, and announcing things like their Fair Work First policies, and even stating their intention to make Scotland a Fair Work world leader by 2025, although I think that's one that they're possibly regretting by now. And it's a bit like the way that our current Scottish Government get a lot of kudos and respect for talking about things like the wellbeing economy. They've done a lot of what you would call, leading thinking at an international level. The First Minister's been seen doing TED Talks around the wellbeing economy and the need to put our population's health and welfare up as a key growth indicator ahead of GDP. And the Scottish Government have set up international groups to support this approach. And I guess the reason I'm mentioning these things is that this is something that our current government are very good at. There's nothing wrong with these concepts. They're great concepts, great aspirations, and how could we not support them as the trade union movement in Scotland? But as the STUC actually put it to the Scottish Government when we met the First Minister last week, the time has come to stop talking about ideas and aspirations and to start having a real discussion about the practical measures that will turn those aspirations into reality for Scotland's workers. And that time is overdue, but particularly just now, coming out of the COVID pandemic and looking at how to rebuild our economy and do all of those lovely warm words like build back better. This is the time where we want to see some real actions going forward, because the reality is, and we all know this, our economy is not working and it's not serving our people's needs. And the reality is that the Fair Work agenda isn't delivering fairer jobs for Scotland's workers yet. And the reality is that a range of solid actions will need to be introduced in the immediate period ahead if Scottish Government's going to have any chance of calling itself a Fair Work world leader by 2025. Scotland has high poverty levels. Prior to the pandemic, 1 in 5 Scots, over 1 million people in this country, were living in poverty, and over half of those had a working adult in their household. So this is in-work poverty that we're talking about. And really that is driven by a prevalence within our economy of low-wage, insecure jobs. We've faced mass privatisations in the past decades, short-term investment, and we've got a dominance of multinationals, and all these things have placed workers in a position of weakness. And this has been exacerbated by government attacks on unions, and it's led to the growth of precarious work through bogus self-employment, 0 hours contracts, and underemployment with unwanted part-time working. So, we can point to a whole range of evidence that shows the state of our labour market and the fact that something needs to be done. But I think the reality is that, we've got hundreds of thousands of Scottish workers who are faced daily with a toxic mix of low wages, insecure contracts, rising fuel and food costs, high rents and poor housing. And we can't even claim to provide basic rights anymore. So, things like good quality affordable housing or a living income for the sick or unemployed isn't there. That safety net isn't there. And we also are facing a raft of anti-trade union laws that prevent unions from accessing workers and workers from organising easily. And that is key. And I'm going to come back to that, because without us actually getting over that hurdle and organising workers and building collective power, doesn't matter what laws are out there, we're not going to make the difference that we need to make. So another challenge that we face, and Gregor mentioned this, is the fact that employment law isn't devolved to Scotland. So we have a government in Scotland that's willing to talk the talk of fair work. And, there's no doubt that if employment law was devolved, they would have more powers to be able to do something about that. It's definitely the STUC's opinion that it should be devolved, and it would help the Scottish Government to achieve its objective if it had the political will to use those powers to become a Fair Work world leader by 2025. But I think the key point that I would like to make is, and it's similar to Gregor's, is that in the meantime, there are a range of other levers already at the Scottish Government's disposal, which must be deployed now. And we can't afford to wait for further constitutional change before we start to put those measures in place. So the STUC strongly agrees with much of the premise of this paper, that the measures currently being taken to implement the goals of Fair Work are too weak, that the rhetoric of Scottish Government on Fair Work is not matched by solid actions to implement it. And although at this stage it remains unclear what level of statutory compulsion could be introduced within procurement, and that's particularly because we're now covered by the Internal Market Bill. So we could be in a situation where we've come out of the frying pan with Europe and very much into the fire, because the UK government now determines through the Internal Markets Bill issues around procurement. But we are actively arguing for strict conditionality around specified Fair Work criteria to be attached to all forms of Scottish Government support and funding going forward. So there's a piece of work to be done to actually tease out exactly what their powers allow them to do. And that's a piece of work that we're looking to get done very quickly in the period ahead. I think there's also no doubt that the period ahead and the economic transition required to rebuild our economy post-COVID, not to mention the imperative that we now have to transition to cleaner, greener industries to meet the challenges of the climate crisis, will require massive stimulus from government and a high level of public investment. That's unarguable going forward. And it is, for me, that also gives us an opportunity in this period going forward, because it's in the public investment that is undoubtedly going to be required, where we are presented with our biggest opportunity to drive forward a commitment to Fair Work principles and to influence pay and conditions for workers. But that's only if we can ensure that government's intervention and support for business and employers in Scotland comes with the right conditions attached. And just to give you an understanding of the size of this leverage, our current procurement budget in Scotland is around 13 billion, and I predict that will grow in the coming period because of the economic challenges faced. So this is leverage that can't be ignored, and it must be deployed by Scottish Government if they're serious about making Fair Work a reality. But we could actually go further than this, and we could attach conditionality to all employer support. So the STUC want the Scottish Government to get creative about this. We're arguing that in return for any publicly funded support, that might be through grants, it might be through tax cuts or benefits, it might be through loans, through the commissioning and procurement processes as far as we can take that, or even through the offering of tax incentives, licensing, permissions, creating permissions for things, or support for taking on apprentices or job creation programmes. And all these things employers can and must be expected to adhere to a clearly defined set of Fair Work principles, and they should be expected to pledge to recognise trade unions when requested to do so by their workers, as well as follow any existing collective bargaining rates laid out in the sectors in which they operate. And I would give you an example of that. The Biden government recently has made announcements that they will be giving out a range of major green contracts, but conditional to getting the licenses to operate in those areas, in the new industries. They're expecting union recognition to be given by those employers. So if the Biden government can look at doing things like that, I don't see any reason why we can't be asking the Scottish Government to put their action where their warm words are. And I think the trade union recognition element of this is really, really important, because there's a whole range of research out there that proves that collective bargaining is the most effective means of delivering improvements to pay and employment conditions, of improving worker safety, of skills development, and giving workers that independent voice that Gregor was talking about. We don't need to win that argument, the evidence is there. And so, as we again said in our meeting last week, we expect the Scottish Government to nail its colours to the mast now when it comes to actually setting out that union recognition and collective bargaining are the most effective means of giving workers voice, and the means that the Scottish Government would prefer. And defining what else we mean by an adherence to fair work principles will also be important, because fair work at the moment means too many things to too many different bodies. I know from the work that I've done on the construction inquiry so far that all these different public sector bodies, be it local authorities, be it Transport Scotland, be it the Scottish Health Service, they have different procurement procedures, they have developed their own guidance, they have a range of different weightings that they apply to the fair work section of their questionnaires when it comes to contracting, and that's really not good enough. I've seen good and bad in all of them. What I'd like to see is the good in all of them applied across the board, so that we have consistent standards that we're expecting people who want to win public contracts to have to fulfill. And we also need to just be really clear about how we train our contracting bodies and how we roll that out and actually make sure that the implementation is standardised. And we also need to make sure that we're asking the right questions. It's not good enough just to ask questions about whether an employer is a living wage employer. In the care sector, it may make sense at this point to ask that question as an indicator of fair work. But in the construction sector, where the rate for the job in most of the skilled roles is well above the living wage, it would be more important to check that an employer is paying the nationally recognised rates set by the various collective bargaining agreements for different trades through their negotiation with trade unions. And sadly, I've yet to come across an example where that question has been asked by a public sector commissioning body in Scotland right now. And delivering on sectoral bargaining in key low wage sectors also has to form a key part of the government's fair work agenda in the immediate period ahead. So yes, we have developed our report in care. We have waited too long for the recommendations of the care report to be implemented. And it's clear that in sectors like care and in sectors like hospitality, we need to get on with the development of sectoral collective bargaining structures that can really lift the wages right across key sectors of our economy. And this is not something that I've seen among, some smaller employers a resistance to, because I've, heard from hospitality employers who would like not to be competing on issues like pay, etc. They would like a level playing field within their sector, so that they have a degree of security and understanding of what they're going to require to pay to secure workers. So yes, it has been frustrating for unions. The government are not moving fast enough from talking about fair work to delivering and acting on it. And we did carry out, and it's right what Lynn says, we need to have a constant dialogue about our relationship with the fair work agenda and about how we challenge that fair work agenda. And we recently carried out, as an STUC General Council, a review of our relationship with the Fair Work Convention, and it was resolved not to walk away from it, but instead to redouble our efforts to make fair work a reality in this very, very crucial period ahead, to hold the government's feet to the fire on their claims that they would become a Fair Work world leader. And also as well as looking to seek to strengthen the Fair Work conditionality and the leverage that it offers, we also need to use what it actually does offer at the moment, and to identify ways of delivering fair work within the government's existing powers, because we do actually have a range of things that we can do, and you know, and some, I've got lots of examples of things that have happened where fair work has been deployed well, even within the limited parameters it offers just now. But we need to make sure that that is strengthened right across the piece. So I guess, you know, that's the parts of the paper that we really agree with, and that we're stepping up our efforts on. I guess that brings me to some of the thrust of the paper that I disagree with. And, you know, one of the first things I would say is that, you know, the current fair work guidance is far from perfect, but I do think that the paper underestimates what it can offer to our movement as leverage right now. I know because our affiliates have told us that the Fair Work Statement, for example, agreed between the STUC and the Scottish Government on workplace safety guidance at the start of the COVID crisis was widely followed by employers, and it was widely used by unions as a negotiating tool with employers. And many of our affiliates reported back to us that it had been very useful in their negotiations at that time. I've also seen numerous examples over recent years of where major affiliates have been successful in employing fair work as leverage to seek and get government intervention on a wide range of issues in the public sector, with voluntary sector employers, and with some private sector employers who receive public funding. And I've seen these interventions produce the desired results. And in fact, in the paper that Gregor's written, I can see some of the examples that have been cited as industrial wins, and obviously that's from press releases, etc., where I know that fair work interventions at a political level also played a key role in assisting unions to secure the wins that were secured. So in some cases, I think we have to take more responsibility as a trade union movement for using what we already do have. We can always argue that it's not good enough, and we can always say we want it better and stronger, and we will continue to do that. But we also need to make sure that our reps and officers across Scotland are aware of what it does offer, that it can be successfully used as leverage, and that it's used more widely and on more occasions. And that's on us as a trade union movement. And the General Council are taking steps to look at trade union education in Scotland with this in mind, so that we are getting the best out of what we have already from the agenda. And I think we need to also keep reminding Scottish Government about the strong statements and actually force them to deliver on the one words. And we need to start ensuring that if they don't deliver on the one words, then they face the embarrassment of their hypocrisy for not putting the right measures in place. I think we could strengthen our efforts in that area, and that's certainly something that we're looking at. And secondly, I just want to say, though, that perhaps we're also expecting far too much from this fair work agenda. I actually think we're deluding ourselves if we think that no matter how strong the regulations we were able to get in place, or how wide the sectoral bargaining that might be established would be, that fair work could ever be a substitute for strong union organisation and the hard resource-intensive work of getting out there and organising workers and building collective power among workers. Because for me, that is the only way that we will increase union membership density and build strong unions that can successfully raise the pay and conditions of our membership. Anything that the Fair Work agenda will do for us is simply just another tool that strong unions will be able to deploy as leverage. So we need to stop thinking that the Fair Work agenda will do things for us that it never ever will. It's not a magic wand, it never will be. And while I think we can ask the Fair Work Convention to help us design and make recommendations to government for the introduction of the strongest fair work leverage possible within the government's current powers, and while I think we can make recommendations about the extension of collective bargaining in key sectors, I don't think that the Fair Work Convention can be charged with coming up with the means to raise union density, because that is not its job. That is our job in the trade union movement. It's on us to get out there and put our resources into organising and rebuilding our movement. There are no shortcuts, and no government is ever going to do that for us. That needs to be done through educating, organising and agitating. And finally, I just want to address the recommendation about the STUC carrying out research on whether fair work is working. And for me, frankly, I think we know the answer to that. And I'm not sure I would be doing research on that at this point in time, because it's not working. It's not strong enough. It's not widely used enough. And it's not currently meeting anywhere near the potential that it has to deliver, and the potential that we need it to be fulfilling to deliver. And I don't think we really need research to tell us that. But what we are doing, and what we perhaps do need to do research on is, and we're looking at this through doing it with the Fair Work Convention, is what more the Scottish Government legally can and should be doing to extend and strengthen fair work conditionality, so that we can make strong recommendations on tightening up the fair work criteria and on what those conditionality clauses could be for employers, and what the Scottish Government's actually allowed to do. So that's something that we're actively working on at the moment, so that we can make those recommendations. And I'll tell you a few other things that we're looking at as immediate priorities for stepping up our agenda around fair work. Scottish Government at the moment are launching a consultation around the Fair Work Vision, and we very much believe that that consultation around the Fair Work Vision should include what more it should be doing with its powers to make fair work a reality. There are also going to be consultations coming up this year around adding fire and rehire and flexible working to the Fair Work First conditions. And we need to ensure, and our biggest priority must be to ensure that public sector contracts are no longer awarded to any employers offering 0 hours contracts, because that is still happening. I think we also are looking at developing and rolling out a fair work module for our reps as part of all shop steward training, so that reps understand what they can use fair work for, and we can see that getting put out across the movement. We need to also look at how we embed fair work principles into our apprenticeship frameworks and standards and tighten that area up, because that's an area where we've got a set of potentially vulnerable workers, and there could be a good piece of work done in that section. And some of that's been looked at in terms of recommendations from the construction sector inquiry. We need to seek Scottish Government commitment to extending sectoral bargaining into hospitality, and we're already working on developing that bargaining machinery within the care sector. We need to work with our culture unions to ensure continued support for the sector, but that support for the sector also needs to be based on fair work conditionality. So bodies like Creative Scotland should not be giving out money to organisations like Horsecross Arts, who are actively trying to de-recognise workers. And we need to ensure that proper training is given and standards are applied right across our public commissioning bodies, our enterprise agencies, And we need to actually monitor the implementation of that. A body, and maybe it is the Fair Work Convention, maybe it needs to be another body, but somebody independent should be monitoring the implementation of this agenda across our public authorities. And the Fair Work Convention report into the construction sector will be coming out before the end of the year, and then we're looking at a report into hospitality, both of which I would expect to make strong recommendations that we would then be looking for government to adopt. So none of that is going to happen tomorrow. It's very frustrating because some of it might not happen, but I guess what I would be saying to comrades within the trade union movement is that we certainly believe within the STUC that this is an agenda worth fighting for. And, you know, we want to see if the Scottish Government are going to make all these statements around fair work, then we want to hang on in there and fight to make sure that they start to deliver the actions that match the rhetoric. So I'll leave it there, but I really look forward to the discussion around this. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Ros. And I just think, having heard both of your contributions, it kind of reminds me that through organisations like the Reid Foundation, we bring together kind of real and genuine debate about the relative values of trade union movement participation. In Gregor's introduction, he spoke about the dangers and traps of social partnership, and he particularly talked about the US model. But there's no one could say that the STUC of today is sitting in bed with the Scottish Government pretending that they're doing something on fair work that they might not be doing. And no one could say that it's not being pushed and there's not leverage out there. I think you both agree intensely that not enough is being done. You both agree intensely that it's Scottish ministers that are taking the kudos for the fact they've got a fair work policy, but it's been through trade union organisation, leverage, and collective bargaining on the ground that that's even got where it is. You both agree that the achievements of fair work have been relatively limited. You both agree that in the public sector, some of the fair work rhetoric has only just been that, it's in name only, and particularly in the procurement of public services and outsourced workers, it's still an absolute scandal. And you both agree that organising workers is the job of trade unions and not government. So there are quite a few questions and contributions that have come into the chat. I'm going to start with the first two that arrived because they're quite short and quite kind of easy to put to you. And I will be putting it to Gregor first, Ross, to give you a chance to breathe and collect your thoughts. But the two I think are really quite linked. And I think I'll probably direct the first one to Gregor. Colette Bradley is saying, what is the criteria for a Fair Work Scotland? So I would be quite interested to hear your response to that, Gregor. And then Suzanne Wright has asked, what actions can trade union branches do to promote fair work? So they're linked, and I'm happy for you both to answer both parts of it, but I thought if I kind of split it that way, it might kind of help in your responses. So Gregor first.
Okay, thank you to both of you for your questions. In terms of the first one, the problem is that there actually aren't criteria. It's not a term that the Fair Work Framework or the Fair Work Convention uses. In the documentation, particularly the first document that outlined the framework, they talk about dimensions, which clearly is a more flexible or malleable term. It's one that is less specific than if they talked about criteria, because if they had talked about criteria or that was in their mind, I think they would have then been able to not nail things down to the nth degree, but to outline quite clearly what those 5 dimensions, that's their term, those 5 dimensions mean in practice. Those are opportunity, security, fulfillment, respect, and security. So it's interesting that you use the term criteria, because it highlights the fact that they don't use it, and I think that is a key weakness. Whether it's possible for the union members of the Fair Work Convention to say that we need to go back and revisit the language and the values underlying it, I don't know, but I think that would be one thing that is helpful, because down the line, it does mean that, as I said, employers who are doing quite different things, all of them, if you like, can claim to be doing something which puts them further along these one or other of these 5 dimensions. So that's the first point I would make. The second one about what union branches can do, I think there are several things here. The first is that unions could, if they haven't already, get themselves in a point where they know what's in the documentation and then can seek to use it with the employers, whether it's through consultation or bargaining or some other thing, in terms, or even in terms of like making public statements about what their employer is or isn't doing. So it shouldn't be ignored, and I think that's clearly a point that Ros was making quite strongly. But at the same time, I think, and I'm sure Ros would agree with this, it needs to be more than just that. So more than just attempts at usage, but also then assessments of what that usage looks like, what were the outcomes of it. And I mentioned that the paper is based on secondary sources, so I didn't go and interview people, which I would have liked to have done had I had the time and resources to do so. But if unions, for example, were able to draw up case studies themselves saying, this is how we attempted to use the Fair Work framework, this particular dimension of it, this is the result that we gained from it, the pros and cons, and therefore also conclude what else they might have needed to do. I think that would be one of the key steps forward. A final thing, once maybe some of that analysis and assessment has been done, is also start campaigning around it, not just through unions and in Scotland themselves and through the STUC, but contacting their MSPs, their MPs and so on, and other bodies that are important, like councils, in setting some of the key employment terms for their employees. So I think that's 3 things that unions could do there. Union branches could do there.
Thanks, Gregor. And Ros?
Yeah, I think the Fair Work sort of framework, I'm not sure that ever was designed to be an attempt to set criteria that people had to follow. I think it was an attempt at the very, very beginning of the process to define what fair work is at quite a fundamental level. And things like worker voice and good pay and security and was to try and define what do we mean by fair work. Criteria to me is a different thing, and I do think that should be coming out from the Fair Work Convention. I think there's a role there for the convention to advise government and set criteria that public procurers should be trained on and have to follow, that should be pushed out through enterprise agencies, that employers should understand in quite a lot of detail and quite strictly what standards they need to follow. And that could be different for a small SME than it is for an employer that has 500 employees. An employer with 500 employees should have to recognise a union and have collective bargaining, simple as that. But I'm willing to understand that an employer with 5 employees maybe doesn't need full collective bargaining structures. But if we had, if that employer was in, for example, the hospitality sector, and we had collective bargaining machinery in that sector, then we would expect that employer, if it gets any government support, to follow the set rates for the job in that sector. And that creates a level playing field in a sector based on fairness. So I think it's quite important to look at different sectors, to look at different sizes of employers and apply criteria that is well thought out, fair, achievable, and that actually delivers for workers on the ground. So to me, that's a whole piece of work that the Fair Work Convention could and should be advising government on, and that's exactly what we're arguing for at the moment, in terms of, you know, some of the practical things that need to happen to turn this from a debate and ideas into something that's grounded in reality and real change and real impact. The other thing around how union what could union branches do to promote fair work, I think that, you know, that's something we're looking at in terms of developing a module, is exactly that. I think Gregor's absolutely right, looking at case studies where, because that is, you know, it's getting that idea that all this is just leverage that we can use within our campaigns as unions. So, you know, you can use it to sort of out and shame employers into doing the right thing, whether it's law or not, because there's loads of laws out there that employers don't follow until they're shamed into doing it, never mind guidance, you know. So you can use guidance like that. We can use it to shame government into intervening by the back door. So I am aware of numerous, and I mean scores of examples where we have made Scottish Government literally pick up the phone and phone employers to tell them that, are they aware they're breaking the Fair Work guidance, you know, and that they can't do anything about it. But it's amazing what a phone call for the Scottish Government that just simply states that fact: you're breaking Scottish Government guidance on this. And it might end up in the papers, you know, we're not sure that there's a bunch of angry trade unionists going to do something about this. Here's a copy of our guidance, you may wish to take it on board. You know, it sounds very, it's not a lot of teeth, but you'd be amazed at the difference that can make in some circumstances. So I guess those are a couple of examples of, you know, what we could be doing. But I just think there's so many reps and so many employers don't even know this even exists. And for me, that's a fundamental problem, because we put a lot of time and effort into developing all these rules, and they're sitting in the, you know, in the drawers of the civil servants, rather than being out there where we can make good use of them. So we need to get it into our education of reps.
That's great, Ros. The next question I'm going to ask is I'm going to paraphrase, because there's some quite lengthy contributions. So Dave Sherry, Sarah Collins and a few others have mentioned public sector disputes specifically, and the disappointment that in this age of fair work, in sectors like rail, like the FE sector, that employers still continue to behave like rogue employers, victimising trade unionists and workers on strike, etc. Now, back at the beginning of the Fair Work era, when I was negotiating for PCS in the Scottish Government sector, one of the big disputes that we had ran for 2 years to get fair work recognition in the National Museums of Scotland, where Fiona Hislop, Minister at the time for Culture, refused to intervene because technically the National Museums of Scotland is run by a trust, even though it's its workers were part of Scottish public sector pay policy, that by every other means they're regarded as civil public servants. That's still the case today in further education. If we're bringing rail back into directly into public ownership, we've got cases all over the public sector where outsourced and procured workers are on two-tier workforce kind of terms and conditions. So how can we, I think that's a nub of the question, how can we if we can't make our public sector employers accountable to fair work, then, you know, what can we do? So Ros, I'll start with you first, and then Gregor. And I'm sorry to Dave and others if I've misrepresented the points that you're making, but I just thought I would pick out that bit of it.
I'm finding it really funny how much of this echoes exactly what our agenda at the meeting last week with the Scottish Government was, but that's exactly the point we made, which was, you know, unless you can enforce this across the public sector, what is the point of this? And I think that's, you know, where we're at. And it really, we got the answer back that there was an expectation by our First Minister that all Fair Work guidance should be undertaken across the public sector, and that was something that was an expectation of the Scottish Government. But that expectation has not been followed at this point in time by all parts of the public sector. And that is something I think we really need to start pushing really, really hard, because that, and it's a bit like I was saying, you know, if they're going to come out with these statements, if they're not going to make them a reality, then we need to hang them with their own petards, because it's just hypocrisy to say one thing but not implement it. And actually it could be implemented across the public sector. There may be the odd UK government run agency where it couldn't be, but across the public sector, I see no reason why the Scottish Government can't ensure and implement Fair Work standards. Now, I'm going to make a slight differentiation with some pay disputes, because I think that's slightly different from things like, you know, derecognition or not giving facility time or fire and rehire. And the reason for that being, you know, you can set up all the bargaining. You can bring, you know, you could have an employer that gives you the best bargaining rights and the best recognition agreement, but unless you've got a bunch of angry workers ready to do something to get a better pay rise, you know, sometimes it's just not going to happen. We do need to, you know, realise that it's our own power and our own collective organisation that wins those battles. But obviously, you know, they ultimately are the funder of organisations, and we shouldn't have things like 0-hour contracts in the public sector. We shouldn't have fire and rehire in the public sector. There are a whole range of things that are beyond the pale. We should have facility time and recognition. We shouldn't have any publicly funded body, you know, putting a staff structure in place to undermine a trade union structure. So all of these things, I think we can draw a fundamental line with. But I do have some sympathy I might not want it to be the answer I get, but I do understand when we get the answer sometimes, no, you know, at pay negotiations between the employer and the workers. You know, we've given them their funding. It's up to the employer what they choose to use that funding to deliver. So I think there's you know, shades of grey in there, but there are some fundamentals that we have to now press forward on. And certainly the commitments we received from Scottish Government just in this past week, which we've publicly, you know, put out there, are ones that we will expect them to enact.
Thanks, Ros. Gregor.
Yeah, I'm reminded of a rather salty phrase from a previous US president who said that he wasn't talking about unions, but I'm applying it to unions, that we need to be able to fart and chew gum at the same time. What I mean by that is that we need to be able to do two things. We need to be able to campaign, and I'm not saying they're entirely separate, but just for the purposes of you know, illuminating the situation, we need to be able to campaign politically to show that the Fair Work policy is not what it says it is, and that may involve trying to get the Scottish Government to, you know, do more, put more pressure on different employers. So that would be the kind of political side of the equation. But the industrial side of the equation, I'm particularly thinking of the disputes recently in further education colleges where there was the attempt to downgrade lecturers to instructors. I think there, and this goes back to the point that Ros made, which, you know, basically what she was saying is that in many cases, you shouldn't expect others to do things that you need to do for yourself. And here, either through using, you know, Fair Work as a rhetorical device, or simply just saying this is a straight battle between, you know, a union and employer, the union needs to organise itself to implement what it wants, to get what it wants, almost regardless of Fair Work. And in this case, that would mean saying, no, we don't accept downgrading of the terms and conditions of lecturers to instructors, because it was essentially robbing the further education lecturers of their, not only their professional status and the knowledge and the expertise that they had, but also leading to, you know, to worse paying conditions. So I think in the context of fair work, unions have got to be able to do those two things at the same time. As I say, sometimes they're related, but in some cases, really, it's a straightforward industrial fight. And I think maybe you know, some of the disputes that we've seen recently highlight that more than anything else.
Okay. I know we're kind of running out of time, and there's heaps of there's heaps of questions and contributions in the chat. A couple of things just to draw your attention to. I think it is useful to point out James Corey and Caroline Hewitt have both referred to, or Caroline's asking about positive examples of employers or training and skills providers that can engage positively around fair work. And James Corey uses an example in Skills Development Scotland where the unions are cooperating on fair work on an apprentice programme. And I think, you know, it's important to point out where there is positive development. So that's something to think about. I know there will be other examples, but many people have mentioned procurement as one of the key factors here. And Paul Sweeney referenced trying to move in Parliament to have the COVID state funding being conditional on recognition of trade unions, but it was defeated by the SNP, Liberals and Tories. And I think that's a really interesting perspective as well. There's a lot more in the chat than that, but those were the couple of areas I thought that slightly kind of varied from what we've been discussing, to put back to you both, and then after that I'll just ask you both to sum up so that we can all get off and have our tea. So Gregor, can I take you first this time?
Sure. I think it was reprehensible that was voted against in Holyrood, and I think Paul Sweeney is to be commended for attempting to get it through in the first place. There's just a couple of points, if I may, that I wanted to pick up on. One of them, well, they both relate to comments that Ros made. The first one was about unions having some more success using the Fair Work policy for leverage, which I don't doubt is true. I think the reason for the explanation for why that didn't show up in the research that I did is that unions are not necessarily making that public. Now, I'm not sure what particular reason there would be for that. I wouldn't want to, speculate there, but I think certainly I do not recall in all the press releases and various documents that I read for this for the research for this work that unions were saying, well, other than maybe in the case of the Scottish Government agreement with POA, PCS and Prospect, I didn't come across any cases of unions saying that. So that's an interesting point, and I think it's not for me to speculate on, as I say, but I think it's something that maybe the unions would need to look at themselves. And the second point is, although I agree with the tenor of what Ros was saying in terms of it's not the job of governments to organise workers, that cannot detract from the point that, or the historical analysis, that in the late 1960s, early 1970s, when union membership rose to above 50% by the end of the 1970s, when collective bargaining was also up about 80%, that governments, the central state in Britain did have a huge role to play in that. And so I'm not saying that Ros was suggesting this, that is saying that she wasn't suggesting that we shouldn't make demands and we shouldn't expect things from the government that support unions. But I think if you kind of take some of what she was saying, you could interpret in an overly syndicalist way, which I don't think that's what she was saying, but I think it may be taken that way by some. And therefore I just wanted to make a slight correction that government states are important in supporting union density, union membership. And yes, unions have to go out and recruit and organise, but there are many, many things that can be done by governments to support that. And I'm particularly thinking in the historical example of the late 60s, early 70s, of where many private sector employers, particularly for non-manual office workers, government policy, both Labour and Tories supported recognition of unions for their staff. That was one of the main reasons why the extent of union membership density and collective bargaining rose to the extent that it did. So we need to be mindful of that.
And Ros?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot in what people have said. I've just been having a look down the chat myself. I think we first of all have to find out and ascertain, and that's for me the important piece of research as we go forward, is ascertain what do they have the power to do right now, and then we can make a set of strong recommendations for, you know, what should be done to strengthen that Fair Work leverage within the current powers of the Scottish Government. And I don't disagree with Gregor in saying that you know, of course we need to get rid of the anti-trade union laws. One of the most important things for unions is access. But you know, right now within the powers of the Fair Work framework, every enterprise agency would happily give a list of employers to unions that they are funding, because they're part of the Fair Work First criteria. And I'm not aware of many unions that are actually actively going out and finding out which employers in their local area have been funded through government funding, or whether we're using that leverage to try and get in to access employers. So I guess there's a bit on both sides, isn't there? It's about having the framework that enables you to do it, but we shouldn't underestimate the amount of resources you need to put in to go out and actually do that movement building, and you know, go out and do that recruitment and organising. It's a significant resource that needs to be invested in that. And if we're going to get strong trade unions again, that investment needs to happen, and it needs to happen quickly.
Okay, thanks for that. So the final thing, I just want to give you a minute or two each to just reflect on the discussion this evening and think what's the takeaway for you and what should we be doing next. So I'll start with Ros and then Gregor.
Okay, well, I think that the takeaway for me is that, you know, this is a priority for the STUC General Council. We've just set our strategy, and we see fair work and the delivery of fair work as being key to our people's recovery agenda, and that's one of our key strategic priorities for the period ahead. So we will be campaigning quite hard to get the fair work the whole agenda tightened up and get some form of regulation in place to support fair work. And we'll also be working really hard on trying to extend the collective bargaining agenda, and we do see that as a priority area. But our number one priority, strategic priority, is around actually building our collective power and industrial power as a trade union movement, and supporting our affiliates to do that. And I think the two go hand in hand. One isn't going to be effective without the other. But what I would like to say is I really welcome the interest there is in this agenda, because we do need to shine a spotlight on the government and really put them under some pressure around this fair work agenda now. They pepper everything with fair work. It gets mentioned about 50 times at every meeting I go to, and half the people in the room, particularly the business half, don't even begin to understand what it means. So we've got a job of work to do, and you know, what I'm convinced about is it's not something we should be spitting the dummy out with and walking away. I feel as though we've only just begun to fulfill the potential of what it could offer us, and it's going to be very hard work to achieve a result out of it, but I think it is worth pursuing.
Okay, thanks for that, Ros. And Gregor?
Yeah, thanks. I'd just like to say thanks again to Ros and the STUC for their help tonight, and to the attendees. I think if approach this in terms of having written the paper as a professor of industrial relations, I think it's better if I think about what the implications are for research and research that's useful for the union movement in Scotland. So I suppose the major thing I'd say is that thinking about the discussion tonight, and particularly some of the comments in the chat function about procurement regulations and the obligations in there, I think there is a research and debate that that needs to be had over whether the Fair Work policy is, you know, it's not worth what it, well, it's not worth the paper it's written on, between that kind of perspective and the kind of curate's egg perspective, which is that it's good in some parts and not in others. I think that we need to do more work to understand that in order to inform what the attitudes and policy and behaviour is that we have, because if you take the issue of procurement, it would seem that there are opportunities to extend the influence of some of the wording of the government policy there. And maybe the issue is that it's not being implemented by those bodies that receive the funding. And it's also, I mean, there was a suggestion, for example, that in the chat that union members should be part of the process that commissions that awards the funding to some of these bodies. So I suppose what I'm saying here is, in terms of some of the opportunities that may exist, it's about ensuring their implementation, because we can always say that the Scottish Government, ultimately the buck stops with it, but we would do ourselves a lot of good by actually getting involved in that process, and that would be through freedom of information requests, taking part in the commissioning process, or the process by which the awards are given to those people, those organisations. So there is something that's there, but I wouldn't detract from the overall thrust of the paper that I've written, which is that if Fair Work is to deliver its ambition of Scotland being a Fair Work nation by 2025, then I don't think it's going to be achievable either at all in the time that's left, or without a huge change in terms of what it currently seeks to do.
Okay, thanks Gregor, and thanks to everyone for your participation, for the questions and contributions in the chat. And again, I apologise for not being able to take them all verbatim, and possibly not interpreting them as they were intended. But as Ros said, it's only just begun, and I know there's a song in that, and I won't even attempt to sing it, or you will definitely be switching off earlier than you should. But it is only just begun, in a sense that where we're going on Fair Work. And I think here in the discussion tonight, I have great hope for the Scottish trade union movement and moving further down into Fair Work. It's also only just begun for the programme for the Jimmy Reid Foundation. We have regular publications and events, and through the magazine Scottish Left Review, we publish, you know, lots of discussions and articles. And coming up in the autumn, we will be announcing soon our annual lecture, which we're hoping to have both in person and live streamed from Glasgow. And if you liked what you heard tonight, our speaker at the lecture this year is going to be Ros Foye, so that you can have more of this at that event coming up in the autumn. And we are still in the anniversary period of the UCS. We've got more events coming up with Unite and work that we're doing together to celebrate that time, and that important time in Scottish trade union history. And also next year, we're planning a big event around the anniversary of Jimmy's inaugural rectorial address at Glasgow University. So there's a lot happening. You can keep in touch through the Reid Foundation website, subscribe and participate in our further debates and discussions. So thank you both. Thank you, Gregor, for your work in in preparing the paper, and thanks Ross for being a good feisty discussant in the debate tonight, and thanks to everybody for your role in advancing fair work in Scotland. So nice to see you all, and
thanks to the chair.
In person soon.
Bye everybody.
Cheerio.